The night in Dorchester was heavier than usual, as if the darkness itself had conspired with the wind to silence the cries of the unseen. In the shadows of the dense pine forests, a figure moved with deliberate grace, a woman cloaked not just in black, but in menace itself. Miriam Blackwell. They would whisper her name decades later with fear, but tonight she was alive, breathing, calculating. Her reputation preceded her. Some called her a witch, others a monster. But the truth was far more insidious. She was a hunter, and her prey were the most vulnerable, enslaved African Americans who dared to dream of freedom. Miriam's family had roots tangled in wealth, politics, and secrets that were never meant for public eyes. Her ancestors had trafficked in human lives, their fortune built on suffering, but she transformed that legacy into something darker, something personal. Her eyes, cold and relentless, scanned the horizon, listening not for sounds of the forest, but for fear. Fear was her currency. She understood psychology in its purest form, reading panic in subtle breaths, catching it in trembling hands. To Miriam, survival was not for the weak, and she took it upon herself to teach lessons in terror. The local authorities often turned a blind eye, whether out of fear, complicity, or the blurred lines of law in the region. But Miriam exploited every crack, every loophole, every whisper of unspoken social rules. She was a shadow in plain sight, a nightmare wrapped in silk and civility. And tonight, she hunted again, leaving no evidence, only terror-stricken survivors who would carry the memory of her cruelty forever. And as she crept toward the cabin at the edge of the clearing, her knife glinting under the crescent moon, the forest seemed to hold its breath. This night, like all nights, would birth a story that the world might never tell, unless someone dared to dig deeper. Like, subscribe, and share if you dare to descend into this darkness. And tell me, where are you watching this from? The wind shifted. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, echoed through the trees. Miriam froze. Something, or someone, was watching her. Miriam's reputation had not arisen from luck or coincidence. Every step she took, every choice she made, was informed by generations of secrets passed down in hushed whispers and hidden manuscripts. Her mother's journals revealed instructions on tracking the invisible, the trails enslaved people left behind, the methods to predict their movements, and the psychological tricks to make them stumble into fear. But Miriam went further. She studied human behavior, understanding how hope could be weaponized against itself. She didn't just hunt bodies. She hunted minds, crafting terror that lingered long after her victims vanished. The small town itself bore scars from her campaigns. Families awoke to empty houses, barns emptied overnight, children missing, livestock dead. Some dismissed it as misfortune or disease, but locals whispered about the woman in black. Churches that preached morality dared not confront her, for even clergy feared the subtle power she wielded, an influence that reached beyond physical violence into manipulation, persuasion, and coercion. Blackwell understood social hierarchies and exploited them with surgical precision. Landowners feared her wrath, the poor feared her presence, and lawmen feared the disruption of the fragile order that kept them in control. And yet, her methods were not merely cruel, they were calculated. She would leave cryptic symbols at the sites of her hunts, messages only she and her chosen few could interpret. Scholars, if they stumbled upon these marks centuries later, would speculate endlessly about occult significance or coded maps, unaware that these were psychological triggers, a way for Miriam to instill a sense of omnipresence in her prey. Fear was not accidental, it was engineered. On this particular night, Miriam approached a river crossing where whispers told of a family attempting to escape. She paused, listening to the faint sound of water and the occasional rustle of leaves, attuning herself to the rhythm of human nerves. She could anticipate panic, decode hesitation, and strike with precision. The forest, a canvas of darkness and secrets, had been her ally since birth, and tonight it would witness yet another act she had meticulously choreographed. But just as she advanced, something unnatural stirred, a shadow within the shadows, that even Miriam could not immediately interpret. That shadow, fleeting yet deliberate, belonged not to an animal, nor to a terrified runaway, but to someone or something observing her. Miriam, for all her cunning, understood the world in terms of control, yet this anomaly introduced doubt, an unfamiliar element that unsettled her. She slowed her breathing, calculating the distance, analyzing shapes, and noting every unnatural pause in the forest's rhythm. It was an instinct honed over decades, a sixth sense cultivated in the pursuit of terror. Miriam's strategy was meticulous. She preferred isolation, corners where escape was impossible, and predictable routines. She knew that human beings relied on patterns, and once a pattern was identified, she could manipulate it to her advantage. But now, the pattern was disrupted. Someone was watching her, a dangerous breach, one that demanded immediate assessment. For a moment, the hunter felt hunted, and in that moment, Miriam realized that even those who operate outside morality, outside law, are vulnerable to forces beyond comprehension. Her life, meticulously controlled, was built on layers of deception, manipulation, and intimidation. Every town official, every slave trader, every desperate runaway carried a role in her symphony of power. Miriam's understanding of authority was primal. She knew that fear could be as binding as chains, and that secrets were currency more potent than gold. Families whispered her name not only because of her acts, but because she understood the subtle art of dominance, the unseen hand that controlled perception. As she scanned the trees, Miriam's mind raced through contingencies. The observer could be a rival, a spy, an intruder, but the unfamiliar energy suggested something else. Something ancestral, almost elemental, brushing against the edges of human comprehension. She had studied maps, journals, and coded texts from obscure societies, learning that human cruelty and human superstition often converged in places like these. And yet, this presence was different. It was not simply human. Miriam pressed forward, compelled by both curiosity and instinct. Her prey awaited, but the forest seemed to grow heavier, as if the darkness itself resisted her control. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the wind carried whispers too faint to be understood, yet too clear to be ignored. Something in the air promised revelations that could undermine everything she believed about power, fear, and dominion. And then, in the corner of her vision, she glimpsed it, a figure neither fully human nor fully shadow, observing her with an intelligence that chilled her to the bone. Miriam froze, every fiber of her being alert, as the figure stepped from the trees, yet the ground bore no imprint of movement. It was a paradox of presence and absence, as though the forest itself had conjured an entity from the void. Her mind, trained to predict and manipulate human behavior, scrambled. Nothing she had studied in the journals of her mother, nothing in the occulted texts of her family's lineage, prepared her for this. The forest, usually her silent ally, seemed to bend and quiver around it, leaves whispering secrets only she could almost comprehend. Instinct compelled her forward. She needed to understand, to assert dominance, yet curiosity gnawed at her fear. The woman she had hunted so mercilessly, the African Americans fleeing for their lives, had operated in the realm of flesh and predictable terror. But this presence was a mirror she could not shatter. Miriam's power derived from patterns, fear, manipulation, absence of hope. But the figure was untethered to pattern. It watched without emotion, a silent judge of her soul, and in its gaze, she glimpsed the reflection of her own darkness magnified, distorted, undeniable. For decades, Miriam had navigated power like a master sculptor. She understood the psychology of the hunted: anticipation, hesitation, desperation. Every movement could be predicted, every choice manipulated. Yet here, in this convergence of shadow and forest, control slipped like sand through her fingers. Her victims had left traces of terror, but this presence left none. Only questions that gnawed at her confidence, questions that demanded recognition of truths she had long ignored. She pressed on, driven by a mixture of defiance and curiosity. Miriam approached the cabin where a family of 4 had been reported hiding, hearts racing with hope, unaware of the predator lurking nearby. Each step was measured, each breath deliberate, yet her mind kept flicking back to the shadow, analyzing it, attempting to categorize it, to reduce it to something manageable. But it resisted categorization. It existed in the realm of forbidden knowledge, a truth hidden from her, a secret that might unravel the very foundation of her understanding of fear. The cabin door creaked as she approached, a sound amplified in the stillness, betraying her presence. Yet the shadow lingered at the edge of perception, unbound, unaccountable. Miriam's hand tightened around the knife, a reflexive anchor to control. She had built her life on fear, but tonight, a fear she could not command had found her. And as she crossed the threshold into the cabin, she realized that this hunt, this night, was unlike any she had orchestrated before. Something ancient, patient, and unyielding was waiting for her inside. Inside the cabin, the family's fear was palpable. The father's eyes darted to the windows. The mother clutched her children, whispering prayers to gods that may or may not have existed. Miriam moved with lethal precision, her presence a tangible weight that bent the room's air, compressing hope into something fragile, breakable. Yet the shadow outside did not flinch, it did not retreat. It observed, silent, calculating. Miriam recognized then that her terror, her control, was being measured against something else, something she could not anticipate. The journals had taught her one immutable truth. Fear could be used, shaped, directed, but never completely controlled. And here, she confronted that truth in a form she had never imagined. The family begged, the father trying to reason, bargaining with a morality Miriam had long since discarded. But she had learned that rationality could be shattered by presence, by suggestion, by demonstrating inevitability. She closed in, each step a sentence, each breath a declaration that hope was optional and fleeting. Yet even as she prepared to strike, the wind shifted again. The shadows seemed to pulse, a rhythm synchronized with the fear in the cabin, yet untethered from her orchestration. Miriam sensed something she could not yet name, that this force was a judge, a witness to centuries of cruelty, a mirror of her own relentless pursuit of power. And in its gaze, she glimpsed not only the family's vulnerability, but the fragility of her own constructed invincibility. The family's screams would echo through the forest for days, perhaps weeks, yet Miriam's attention flicked to the anomaly, and in that instant, she understood that tonight was no ordinary hunt. Something had crossed the threshold from legend into reality, testing the boundaries of control she had so meticulously honed. The knives, the fear, the precise choreography, all seemed secondary now to the presence that defied explanation, that had entered her world not as prey, not as competitor, but as reckoning. And then, before Miriam could react further, a sound split the night, a child's whisper, not of fear, but of knowledge, as if the forest itself spoke through them, revealing a truth no human should have to hear. Miriam froze at the child's whisper, a syllable carried on the wind like a forbidden invocation. It named her, yet not with fear or reverence, simply with recognition, as those centuries of hidden truths had condensed into a single utterance. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening, its shadows thickening, pressing against her skin. For the first time in her life, she felt uncertain, and uncertainty was a tool she had never wielded against herself. Every act of terror, every manipulation, every carefully engineered panic had prepared her to dominate others, but not to face a presence that anticipated her, that understood her fully, and yet remained untouched. Her hand tightened on the knife, the iron cold and real against her palm, grounding her. She was trained in fear, in manipulation, in exploiting weakness. But what she faced now was something older than her craft, older than her lineage, and it was as silent as it was patient. Miriam's mind raced, searching for a precedent, a reference point, a ritual, anything that could grant understanding. But the forest offered nothing but whispers and shifting shadows, as if mocking her centuries of dominance. In her mother's journals, there were accounts of spirits, of watchers, of forces that observed human cruelty and occasionally intervened. Miriam had dismissed them as superstition, convenient myths to explain the unexplained. But now, faced with this presence, she understood that some truths were deliberately concealed, not because they were impossible, but because the human mind could scarcely endure them. And yet, the child's eyes, wide and knowing, reflected comprehension far beyond her years, a clarity that hinted at a forbidden history Miriam had never imagined. She advanced slowly, the cabin's air thick with tension. Her prey huddled together, fear and hope entangled in their limbs. And yet, Miriam's gaze kept flicking outward, toward the shadow that had followed her, following the hunt, following her consciousness itself. This night, this hunt, had shifted from a simple exercise in terror into a confrontation with forces she could neither predict nor dominate. And as the child whispered again, a name Miriam had thought buried in the annals of forbidden history, she realized that her legacy, her crimes, and her carefully cultivated control might be measured against an ancient reckoning that had finally arrived. Miriam's mind raced. The name spoken by the child resonated like a bell tolling through the corridors of forbidden knowledge. It connected threads she had never traced, a lineage of shadowed acts and buried atrocities spanning generations, some her own, some ancestral, some predating her birth. Miriam had always prided herself on knowing every lever of power in her environment. Yet here, the forest, the shadow, and the child had conspired to reveal gaps she could no longer ignore. She moved to silence them, her instincts razor-sharp, yet the knife felt almost symbolic against the unfolding realization that her actions, her hunting, her engineered fear were being cataloged, observed, and weighed by forces she could neither comprehend nor evade. The family trembled, but Miriam's attention was fractured, her control slipping. She had built terror like a cathedral, structured, imposing, inevitable. But this was not a cathedral. This was a storm, elemental and uncontainable. Her understanding of history, of human psychology, had prepared her to manipulate the living, to bend moral and social codes to her will. But the revelation from the child hinted at knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, a hidden agenda spanning continents and centuries, a suppressed truth about the nature of fear and punishment that humans were never meant to fully grasp. Miriam felt a flicker of unease, the first authentic unease of her life. Every step forward was now a negotiation with forces unseen. She had once orchestrated terror for profit, for power, for legacy, but now she was faced with terror not of her making, an intelligence observing, cataloging, judging. The family in the cabin sensed the shift, the tension in the air, the unnatural awareness that had entered their hunter's psyche. For once, fear was not only theirs, it had seeped into Miriam herself. And then the shadow moved closer, fluid, deliberate, as if testing the boundaries of her awareness, revealing that every act she had committed, every secret she had buried, every life she had ended, was not hidden at all. The forest seemed alive, sentient, and patient, with centuries of observation folded into a single, terrifying now. Miriam's breath caught. The knife was no longer her authority. It was a relic of a world that could no longer contain her. And somewhere, deep in the trees, the shadow whispered a truth she had never dared consider. That even monsters are subject to reckoning. The weight of centuries pressed down on Miriam as the shadow hovered at the edge of her vision. She had always understood fear as a tool, flexible, malleable, capable of shaping obedience and submission. But here, fear was a reflection, a mirror showing her the consequences of her deeds magnified into something vast and ancient. The family's desperation, the child's awareness, the forest's silence, it all coalesced into a single message, that her understanding of power was incomplete, dangerously naive, and painfully human. Miriam advanced, driven by instinct and arrogance. She had survived countless hunts, navigated the murky complicity of townsfolk, and evaded justice through cunning and intimidation. Yet, tonight, every assumption was challenged. Every tactic was inadequate. Her usual precision faltered under the weight of an intelligence she could neither locate nor comprehend. She realized that some knowledge, some truths, were designed not to be mastered by mortals, and yet here they stood, confronting her with a relentless insistence. The forest itself seemed to rearrange, branches bending as if to guide or obstruct, leaves whispering in languages forgotten by time. Miriam felt the weight of history pressing against her chest, a pressing reminder that her cruelty was neither invisible nor eternal. Generations had observed, recorded, judged, and here the culmination of their silent vigilance manifested in this shadow. She was no longer the architect of fear. She was an observer of something greater. Inside the cabin, the family shivered, sensing a change beyond comprehension. The child's whispered names acted as keys, unlocking doors in Miriam's mind that she had long sealed against doubt or introspection. Each syllable carried forbidden knowledge, revelations about the hidden currents of power that guided, shaped, and punished human cruelty over centuries. Her own lineage, built on terror and manipulation, was suddenly just one strand in a tapestry of much darker and ancient designs. And as Miriam's knife rose, intending to assert dominance, the shadow shifted, flowing like smoke, blocking the final step, a barrier not of flesh, but of revelation. It spoke without words, a presence that demanded understanding, acknowledging her skill while simultaneously undermining it. Miriam's instinct screamed, yet intellect wrestled with horror. She realized in that heartbeat that the night had changed, the hunter had become prey, not in body, but in understanding. And then the cabin door slammed shut on its own, the echo resonating like a verdict in a court older than the town itself. The slam of the door reverberated through Miriam's chest, shaking the delicate construct of control she had cultivated for decades. The forest outside seemed to pulse, responding to her hesitation. She had been a predator for so long that the absence of immediate prey unsettled her, yet the true disquiet lay elsewhere. The shadow, unyielding and intelligent, observed from the edges of perception, a constant reminder that her mastery over fear and death was no longer absolute. The family's whispered prayers grew louder, not in desperation, but in confidence, as if the presence in the forest lent them courage. Miriam's mind raced. Years of strategy, of manipulating hope, of predicting panic, could all be undone by forces beyond her comprehension. She realized that the child's awareness was not an anomaly. It was a catalyst, a vessel through which forbidden truths could pierce even the darkest minds. Her knife, once an extension of control, now felt heavy, impotent. Every tactic she had employed, the silence, the stalking, the intimidation, was reduced to a faint shadow against the enormity of the unknown that now pressed in. The forest seemed alive, the wind carrying fragments of suppressed knowledge, whispers of hidden histories, and warnings of consequences that spanned generations. Miriam's ancestors had trafficked in human lives, their sins buried in secrecy, but this night exposed the fragility of that concealment. For the first time, Miriam considered escape, not because of fear for her life, but fear for her legacy. The shadow was not just observing. It was evaluating, weighing each atrocity, each manipulation, and each secret buried beneath layers of control. She had understood power as dominion over flesh and mind, yet now she confronted power as observation, as history, as judgment. And then the cabin shifted. walls seeming to stretch, shadows elongating, a subtle vibration coursing through the floorboards. The family no longer appeared afraid. They were witnesses, participants in a revelation beyond mortal comprehension. Miriam's breath caught as a cold, almost sentient gust of wind whispered her own name, carrying not fear, but acknowledgement, a recognition of Deed's long-thought secret. She understood, at last, that the night was no longer hers. The hunter had stepped into the hunting ground of forces older, deeper, and more deliberate than she could manipulate. And somewhere in the shadows, a sound like 1,000 pages turning echoed, as if history itself was rewriting her story. Miriam's pulse quickened as the forest seemed to shift around her, shadows bending like living things. The air was thick with secrets, the kind buried so deeply that even the most meticulous records could not capture them. She had always relied on mastery over human perception, yet now the rules she had known were suspended. The cabin, the family, the whispering child, they were all conduits, mirrors of truth she had meticulously ignored. Every act of cruelty, every manipulation, every human life she had ended was a thread in a tapestry now revealed to forces she could neither flee nor dominate. Her mind flicked through centuries of forbidden knowledge, piecing together fragments buried in coded journals, hidden manuscripts, and ancestral letters that hinted at a broader design of power. Blackwell was not just a hunter. She was a participant in a continuum, a small yet deliberate agent in a chain of suppressed truths. Families, lineages, and institutions had long concealed atrocities, not for morality, but for preservation. Control over narrative was power itself. And tonight, the narrative was unraveling before her eyes. The child's gaze, steady and unblinking, was a puzzle Miriam could not solve. Knowledge beyond years, understanding beyond lineage, and courage beyond instinct. The child held a key to forbidden histories, truths that institutions had spent lifetimes suppressing. The shadow lingered near, an extension of those truths, or perhaps their enforcer. Miriam's knife, once the apex of her control, now felt insignificant, a relic in a storm that demanded comprehension, not dominance. She pressed forward, compelled by the hunger for understanding. Yet every step deepened the awareness that she was not alone in this orchestration. The forest whispered with the weight of observation. The walls of the cabin seemed porous, carrying the echoes of long-buried knowledge, reminding her that power could be measured not just in fear, but in secrecy, in the manipulation of perception across generations. And then, from a corner of the cabin, a symbol etched in the wall caught her eye. Not random, not accidental, a mark of ancient significance, a reminder that her ancestors had operated under surveillance of forces she had dismissed as myth. This symbol glowed faintly in the candlelight, a warning that the past she believed controlled was in fact under scrutiny. Miriam felt the first true tremor of vulnerability. She was no longer orchestrating terror. She was witnessing judgment, and the realization threatened to unravel the very foundations of her identity. And as her eyes locked with the shadow, just beyond the threshold, she understood that tonight she might not leave the forest the same. Miriam's thoughts twisted in the dim light, recalling the methods she had perfected over decades. She had never killed indiscriminately. Each strike, each disappearance, had been calculated with psychological precision. But the symbols on the wall, the faint glow, the impossibly precise lines, suggested an intelligence beyond the mortal realm, a network of understanding that spanned decades, perhaps centuries. Each victim she had taken, each secret she had maintained, was cataloged, preserved, scrutinized. And now, the forest, the child, the shadow, all were witnesses to her legacy, assessing, evaluating, recording. Her gaze drifted to the family huddled in terror, yet there was a strange clarity in their fear. They were no longer just victims. They were mirrors reflecting the ancient truths Miriam had ignored. Her mind raced, drawing connections between her family's past, the suppressed histories of the region, and the patterns that governed both power and oppression. She had believed herself untouchable, operating above consequence. Yet now she realized that the universe had methods far subtler and more relentless than human law. Miriam approached the wall, compelled to decipher the symbol. It radiated knowledge she could not yet grasp, yet instinct whispered its significance. She could feel history folding in upon itself, each etched line a memory of deeds she had long thought forgotten. Generations of suppressed knowledge were converging in this cabin, and she, Miriam Blackwell, hunter of souls, was now part of their reckoning. The shadow drifted closer, its presence both oppressive and illuminating. Miriam realized that control, the very thing she had defined herself by, was slipping through her fingers. The knife, her weapon, her authority, was useless against the unfolding revelation. Power was not in the body, nor in fear. It was in understanding, in the ability to navigate truths that had been hidden for centuries. And in that moment, the child whispered again, words that struck Miriam like lightning. A phrase so ancient, so precise, that it connected her crimes to the hidden agendas of the region's most powerful institutions, revealing a network of manipulation, psychological control, and corruption that extended far beyond her personal vendettas. Miriam's heart raced. She understood that she was at the center of something far greater than terror or murder. She was entangled in forbidden knowledge, secrets that powerful men and institutions had buried, now awakened in the darkness of Dorchester. And as a branch scraped against the cabin wall with unnatural precision, she sensed the forest itself preparing to speak its next revelation. Miriam's fingers trembled as she traced the glowing symbol, a mixture of fear and fascination coursing through her veins. Each line, each curve, resonated with a knowledge she had never been allowed to comprehend, a history meticulously hidden, carefully erased from records. It spoke of the human mind, of manipulation over generations, and of forces that orchestrated terror long before she had been born. She realized, with a chilling clarity, that her role had been minor, a single instrument in a vast machinery of control she had barely begun to perceive. The shadow shifted, moving with intelligence, observing her reaction, adjusting its presence to probe the limits of her comprehension. Miriam felt her usual arrogance falter. She was accustomed to dominance, to orchestrating fear, to predicting every human response. But this intelligence, ancient and calculating, rendered her predictability irrelevant. Her victims, her hunts, even the hidden archives of her family's lineage, none of it mattered to the force assessing her now. In the cabin, the family remained frozen yet resolute, their presence somehow amplifying the weight of revelation. Miriam understood that they, too, were conduits of knowledge, vessels through which the suppressed truths of Dorchester's hidden past were beginning to speak. Every scream she had inflicted, every disappearance she had orchestrated, now resonated within a context she had never considered. History was watching, memory was alive, and she, Miriam Blackwell, was caught in the nexus of judgment and revelation. She stepped back, the knife lowered, her mind racing. The forest, the shadow, the symbol on the wall, they all converged into a single, undeniable understanding. Her legacy of cruelty was not hidden, not safe, not eternal. There were forces beyond comprehension, archives beyond human eyes, and judges beyond mortal reckoning, all converging to weigh her deeds against a standard she had never encountered. And as the candle flickered, casting elongated, twisting shadows, Miriam realized that the forest itself had become a library of secrets, each gust of wind a whisper of suppressed truths, each rustle a record of human transgression. Her life, her hunts, her reputation, all were now a subject of scrutiny far beyond mortal understanding. And then, from the shadows, came a sound, a voice neither human nor animal, that began to recite a history Miriam had been forbidden to know, a history that would shatter her perception of control. Miriam's ears strained to catch the voice, a cadence older than memory, older than the lineage she had once revered. The words traced a tapestry of suppressed knowledge, hidden agendas, and psychological manipulation spanning centuries. Families, churches, and institutions had colluded in silence, burying atrocities under layers of law and civility. Miriam's own ancestors had been active participants, and now she, the apex of their cruelty, was being confronted by the cumulative weight of truth. Every syllable struck her like a revelation. The shadow hovered closer, more defined, almost corporeal in its presence. Miriam realized that the patterns she had relied upon, human predictability, fear, instinct, were insufficient. She faced a network of observation, of judgment, of memory that transcended flesh and blood. History itself was alive, and she was a subject, not the master. Her knife felt inadequate, her carefully constructed dominance meaningless against the intellect that now encircled her. The child's whisper acted as a key, unlocking forbidden chambers in her mind, revealing truths she had spent a lifetime ignoring. The meticulous orchestration of terror by hidden forces, the manipulation of morality and law for centuries, and the deliberate suppression of African American resistance by powerful institutions. The cabin, once a stage for her mastery of fear, now felt like a courtroom, the walls echoing testimonies of the past. Miriam felt panic she had never allowed herself to experience. Every act of cruelty she had committed was cataloged, analyzed, weighed against standards older and more unforgiving than human law. The shadow shifted again, folding into the candlelight, illuminating traces of history written in symbols too precise to be coincidence. Miriam understood that she was being instructed, not attacked, that the forest, the shadow, and the child were guiding her into a confrontation with the very foundations of suppressed knowledge. And then the words coalesced into a phrase, a single declaration of ancient judgment that Miriam could neither ignore nor escape, reverberating through her mind like a tolling bell. The past she had tried to control had begun to control her. Miriam staggered back, her mind reeling from the weight of comprehension. Every crime, every calculated act of terror, every manipulated mind had been part of a continuum she had only just glimpsed. The forest was no longer merely a hunting ground. It was an archive, alive with memory, intent, and judgment. The child's unyielding gaze seemed to channel the consciousness of generations, a living repository of truth and consequence. Miriam realized she was ensnared, not by flesh or blade, but by knowledge itself. Her instincts urged action, but intellect warned restraint. She had faced human threats before. She had exploited lawmen, rival hunters, and terrified families. But the forces at work tonight were neither human nor bound by the limitations of mortality. The shadow moved with purpose, aligning itself with the flow of revelation, its presence a tangible force of reckoning. Every flicker of candlelight cast new shapes, revealing patterns of history she had never been permitted to see. Hidden networks, deliberate manipulations, and carefully orchestrated erasures. Miriam's training in fear, control, and dominance faltered under the enormity of it. She had spent a lifetime perfecting terror, yet the terror she faced now was intellectual, psychological, spiritual. It was the realization that her actions, her legacy, and her lineage were only threads in a vast, conscious tapestry, one that observed, judged, and corrected. The child whispered again, a phrase of power and remembrance, connecting Miriam's deeds to the broader machinery of oppression and institutional control. Miriam understood that the horrors she inflicted were not isolated. They were echoes of centuries of manipulation and suppression, of knowledge deliberately hidden from the human mind. And then the shadow extended, almost tangible now, merging with the edges of the cabin, pressing a presence into Miriam's consciousness that demanded acknowledgement. That fear alone is not power. That control is an illusion, and that even the most cunning predators are subject to the reckoning of history itself. Miriam's grip on reality faltered as the shadow pressed closer. She had always believed power resided in fear, manipulation, and the careful orchestration of consequence. But now she saw that power could also reside in memory, in observation, in the deliberate preservation of hidden truths. The family huddled together, witnessing this transformation, their fear tempered by understanding, their presence amplifying the weight of revelation. Miriam realized she was no longer the architect of terror. She was a subject under evaluation. Her knife, once an extension of control, felt absurdly small in the face of this intellectual and spiritual reckoning. Every victim she had claimed, every act she had meticulously engineered, was cataloged in the fabric of this ancient awareness, weighed against standards older than any law or morality she had studied. The forest, the shadow, the child, they were instruments of a force that could measure human cruelty in a way the mortal world never could. Miriam's mind raced, attempting to reconcile her learned skills with the reality she faced. She had always studied psychology, human behavior, and social manipulation. Yet now she confronted a consciousness that transcended all she knew. The symbols etched on the cabin walls, the whispers of the child, the movement of the shadow, they were teaching her, instructing her in forbidden truths she had spent a lifetime avoiding. And as the candle flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls, Miriam understood something chilling. The power she had wielded, the fear she had inspired, the secrets she had buried, none of it would remain hidden. History, observation, and judgment were converging in this small cabin in Dorchester, and she was at the center of it. The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath, and Miriam felt the weight of eternity pressing upon her, forcing the first true question she had ever asked herself. Could even she survive the consequences of knowledge too powerful to ignore? And then, from the corner of the room, the shadow leaned closer, its presence whispering a secret of the past that would change everything she thought she knew. Miriam's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind grappling with revelations that exceeded the limits of mortal comprehension. The shadow, once an enigma, now pulsed with intention, a deliberate force guiding her awareness through layers of history she had never been permitted to explore. The symbols, the whispers, the child's uncanny understanding, all were nodes in a network of suppressed truths, revealing hidden agendas, institutional corruption, and the manipulation of generations long past. Her hands trembled over the knife. It was no longer a tool of dominance. It was a relic, a reminder that physical power could not contend with the weight of accumulated, deliberate knowledge. Miriam understood that her legacy of terror was a single thread in a vast tapestry of psychological control, suppression, and elite manipulation. Families, churches, and institutions had acted in concert to maintain these secrets, ensuring obedience and submission for centuries. The child's voice rang again, repeating a phrase Miriam could scarcely process, yet its significance penetrated her mind with clarity. She realized that each act of cruelty she had committed was being measured against standards she had not known existed, cataloged as part of a continuum of power and suppression that transcended human lifetimes. The shadow moved with intent, circling her, probing, teaching, judging. Miriam's instincts screamed for control, but intellect whispered that she was outmatched, that understanding, raw, unflinching, and absolute, was the only path forward. Every scream she had elicited, every life she had taken, every secret she had hoarded was now laid bare in a framework of forbidden history she had never anticipated. Her mind swirled with realization. She was at the intersection of personal legacy and cosmic judgment. Every moment, every decision, every heartbeat was under scrutiny, and the forest, alive with centuries of memory, would not permit ignorance. And as the shadow's form solidified, merging with the child's gaze, Miriam heard the first explicit warning of this reckoning. That knowledge withheld is power denied, and power misused is a debt the soul must ultimately pay. Miriam staggered, her carefully constructed world unraveling under the weight of revelation. The shadow, now undeniably intelligent, hovered just beyond the candlelight, and the child's repeated phrases etched themselves into her consciousness. A litany of forbidden truths, symbols, and suppressed knowledge. She understood, with an almost paralyzing clarity, that her mastery of fear, her manipulation of lives, and her orchestration of terror were mere components in a system of control far beyond her understanding. The family's fear had transformed into quiet vigilance, as if they recognized forces older than themselves shaping the events in the cabin. Miriam's training in psychology, in human behavior, in manipulation, failed against this higher intelligence. The shadow and the child represented the culmination of centuries of observation, judgment, and preservation of forbidden history. Her crimes were cataloged, analyzed, and weighed against standards she could never have anticipated. For the first time, she felt exposed, not just physically but spiritually, psychologically, and historically. Every victim, every act of terror, every secret hidden in her family's lineage now reverberated through a network of truth she could neither evade nor control. Miriam's mind raced as she tried to reclaim dominance, but the weight of knowledge and judgment pressed too heavily. Now, viewers, I want you to participate. Comment the phrase "the shadow remembers" twice in the comments below. Say it, and acknowledge that some truths are too powerful to ignore. The shadow leaned closer, its presence a reminder that understanding, not fear, is the ultimate reckoning. Miriam realized she had stepped into a history alive with observation, and that the consequences of hidden knowledge were immediate, inescapable, and absolute. The cabin fell into a tense silence as Miriam processed the child's repeated phrases. The shadow remembers, they whispered, and it reverberated in her mind like a bell tolling across centuries. The forest outside seemed to pulse with memory, every rustle and crack a testimony of hidden agendas, ancient corruption, and suppressed truths. Miriam realized she had underestimated the breadth of her own legacy. The way her ancestors' deeds were entwined with a network of control designed to shape generations, to conceal atrocities, and to punish dissent. She stepped forward, compelled to assert some fragment of control, yet every movement seemed observed, measured, and catalogued by forces beyond comprehension. The shadow hovered near, neither malevolent nor benign, but fully aware, pressing her to recognize that power derived not from domination of others, but from a mastery of forbidden knowledge, and her ignorance now placed her squarely in the position of the hunted. Miriam's mind, trained for decades in predicting human behavior, faltered. She realized the child was more than a witness. They were an instrument, a conduit for truths hidden by centuries of manipulation. Every scream she had provoked, every life she had extinguished, resonated within a larger framework of control, a network she had only now begun to perceive. The forest, the cabin, the shadow, all were alive with accumulated memory, and each detail was a lesson, a warning, a revelation. Her knife, once a tool of authority, felt hollow in her hand. Power had shifted from the tangible to the intangible, from fear to knowledge, from dominance to understanding. She had been trained to orchestrate terror with precision, but now terror was irrelevant. What mattered was comprehension of the forces she had ignored. The shadow pulsed, a silent teacher, guiding her gaze to symbols etched deeper than the human eye could perceive, revealing patterns of institutional control, psychological manipulation, and historical suppression of African American lives that Miriam had been complicit in perpetuating. She took a slow breath, realizing that this night was no longer her hunt, but her reckoning. Every decision she made would either grant her insight into these forces or condemn her to the very terror she had once dispensed. And then, without warning, a gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the cabin into darkness. In that moment, Miriam understood. The forest was alive, and the shadow was no longer just observing. It was moving, preparing to reveal a truth that would change everything she believed about power, history, and herself. Darkness enveloped Miriam, Yet she could sense the presence of the shadow, an almost sentient awareness brushing against her consciousness. Her vision, now adjusted, caught glimmers of the etched symbols glowing faintly, revealing a secret language she had never known existed. These symbols weren't mere markings. They were encoded histories, hierarchies of hidden agendas, and records of manipulation stretching back centuries. Miriam realized she had been operating in a blindfolded theater, her actions cataloged not only by human memory, but by forces older, sharper, and infinitely patient. Every step she took in the dark cabin echoed, not just in the physical space, but through layers of observation, as if the building itself remembered her deeds. She recalled her own hunting strategies, her precise application of fear, her manipulation of townsfolk and runaways. But now she could see the limits of her understanding. Fear alone was insufficient. Control alone was temporary. The forest, the shadow, and the child demanded comprehension, a reckoning of knowledge rather than of flesh. Miriam's mind raced through forbidden texts she had studied in secret. Journals detailing human cruelty, manuscripts documenting suppression of African American escape networks, notes on psychological conditioning and control of perception. Each text had prepared her for mastery over mortality, but none had prepared her for mastery over truth itself. The shadow, patient and omnipresent, revealed that knowledge itself was power, and ignorance, even arrogance, was vulnerability. Her body tensed, sensing movement around her, though nothing touched her. The cabin became a nexus of history, memory, and judgment, its walls alive with observation. The child's whispers intertwined with the shadows, guiding Miriam's understanding. Every act of cruelty she had inflicted, every secret she had buried, resonated through this living archive. And then, a single phrase, carried not by wind, but by consciousness itself, struck Miriam. All control is an illusion, and those who pray must answer to the unseen. Her instinct screamed, yet her intellect forced recognition. This was no longer a hunt she could dominate. She was inside a system of reckoning older than her family, older than the town, older than herself. Miriam's hands shook, the weight of revelation pressing down. She had been a master of terror, a conductor of fear, yet now she faced forces that measured cruelty not in screams or blood, but in memory, in observation, in the orchestration of history itself. The shadow, silent but undeniably aware, hovered closer, nudging her to see what she had refused to acknowledge. That every life she had hunted, every secret she had hidden, was part of a continuum of manipulation and suppression that no human mind could fully grasp. The child's eyes shone in the darkness, reflecting knowledge Miriam could only attempt to comprehend. These were not innocent eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had absorbed centuries of suppressed truth, who could see patterns in horror and control that she had spent decades perfecting. And in that realization, Miriam felt the first true pang of fear, not for her life, but for her understanding, her legacy, and the limits of her mastery. The cabin's walls seemed to pulse, revealing faint lines of history previously invisible, maps of escape routes intercepted by hidden networks, names erased from records by systemic corruption, the orchestration of terror on a scale she had barely imagined. Miriam understood that her own family's legacy of hunting and killing African Americans was only a small fragment in a vast machine of control spanning generations. Her knife, once an instrument of dominance, now felt insignificant against the weight of accumulated judgment. She realized that the forest, the shadow, and the child were not merely present. They were agents of comprehension, teaching her that power derived from knowledge and consequence, not fear alone. And then, a whisper, so close it seemed to come from within her own mind. The past watches and the present answers. Will you see or perish? Miriam's heart skipped, knowing she was being challenged to reconcile her crimes with truths older and larger than herself. Miriam stumbled, her mind assaulted by the weight of centuries. Each revelation peeled back layers of hidden agendas, suppressed histories, and deliberate manipulation spanning generations. She had prided herself on understanding human fear, but she now realized that fear was only a tool, a veneer over a deeper truth, that history itself observed, cataloged, and judged those who inflicted terror. The child spoke again, repeating fragments of forbidden knowledge. Names, dates, actions erased from records, atrocities orchestrated with precision and hidden beneath layers of institutional complicity. Miriam understood the magnitude. She was part of a system far larger than her own hunting, a system designed to manipulate, oppress, and erase. Her family's legacy, her mastery over fear, her crimes, each was a thread in a tapestry that had been deliberately obscured, until now. The shadow moved closer, its presence heavy, pressing against her mind. It demanded recognition, comprehension, not obedience. Miriam had always believed that control was dominance, but she now understood that control could exist only in alignment with truth, and that ignorance, arrogance, and cruelty were liabilities exposed under the scrutiny of forces older than human law. Her breath caught as the cabin seemed to grow, walls stretching into invisible corridors filled with whispers, echoes of every secret act ever committed in the forest vicinity. Miriam felt the pressure of observation, a relentless weighing of deeds, intentions, and consequences. Fear had lost its value. Comprehension was now the only currency that mattered. And then, in the darkness, the child whispered a phrase Miriam had long avoided, a symbolic invocation of reckoning. The chains of silence are broken. Miriam realized that tonight, her mastery, her legacy, and her life were being rewritten in a language older than memory, a language she could no longer ignore. Miriam's instinct screamed, urging escape, yet every fiber of her being knew that flight would be meaningless. The cabin, the forest, the shadow, and the child had converged into a nexus of revelation, and she was caught in the center. Every action she had ever taken, the hunts, the manipulations, the carefully orchestrated terror, resonated now within a framework of historical judgment she could not evade. Symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly, illuminating suppressed networks of power, manipulation, and institutional corruption. Miriam realized that her understanding of dominance had been incomplete. She had feared flesh, but she now feared knowledge, consequence, and the meticulous records of history. The shadow, more defined now, pressed closer. Miriam's knife felt weightless, irrelevant. Fear, her former ally, had become impotent against this intelligence that measured not her actions, but the hidden agendas behind them, the psychological manipulation she had perfected, and the suppressed truths she had enforced. And then the child's voice cut through, insistent, echoing in her mind, "History remembers. The unseen watches, and the guilty are not spared." Miriam's breath caught. She realized that her mastery of terror had been an illusion, a temporary dominance over bodies and minds, but powerless against the permanence of recorded truth. The forest outside seemed to shift, alive with memory, observing, preserving every act of cruelty, every suppression of knowledge. Miriam understood that she was inside a judgment that spanned centuries, one that could not be deceived or evaded. And as the shadow leaned closer, merging with the candlelight, Miriam felt the first undeniable truth of her existence. She had hunted others without understanding the forces that had hunted her all along. Miriam's mind reeled as comprehension flooded her. Every scream she had induced, every life she had extinguished, every secret she had buried, each act was now a record in a system of observation and judgment that transcended human law. The shadow, once a curiosity, now felt omnipresent, an arbiter of truths she had denied. The child's repeated phrases, the symbolic invocation of reckoning, echoed in her mind. Knowledge preserves, memory judges, history remembers. Miriam realized that she had not only been complicit in cruelty, but had become a node in a web of manipulation, suppression, and elite control that had been meticulously maintained across generations. She tried to step forward, to reclaim dominance. But the cabin seemed to expand, walls stretching into invisible corridors filled with whispers of erased histories. The forest outside pulsed with awareness, every rustle, every crack a testimony to the system she had served and now confronted. Her knife, once a tool of terror, hung useless at her side. Power had shifted from the tangible to the intangible, from fear to comprehension. Miriam was learning that dominance without understanding is hollow, and cruelty without consequence is impossible to maintain against forces older and more deliberate than any human institution. And then, the shadow's presence pressed fully against her mind, revealing the first of a series of truths so ancient and deliberate that Miriam realized her understanding of morality, history, and control had been shallow, a facade crumbling under the weight of reckoning. Miriam's mind trembled under the weight of revelation. The shadow, now undeniably sentient, revealed histories that had been deliberately erased. Accounts of families torn apart, African-American lives hunted and suppressed, institutions complicit in maintaining the facade of civility while orchestrating terror. She saw the architecture of manipulation, how fear had been cultivated, how obedience had been trained, how silence had become a weapon. Every act she had committed was a small piece in a vast machinery of control, and now she was confronting the operators, not the victims. The cabin seemed to breathe, walls bending with whispers from centuries past. Miriam realized that her ancestors' cruelty had been both observed and catalogued, that she had inherited more than a legacy of terror. She had inherited a reckoning she could not escape. The shadow glided closer, its form almost human, almost divine, radiating awareness. It did not speak. It merely projected understanding into Miriam's mind. She knew that power resided not in the knife, nor in the fear she once inspired, but in the comprehension of patterns, in the recognition of systems older than human morality. Her vision shifted to the family in the cabin. They were not merely witnesses. They were participants in the awakening of hidden truths. Their presence amplified the revelation. Their lives intertwined with suppressed histories, and their survival depended not on fleeing, but on understanding the web of control Miriam had helped perpetuate. She saw connections she had never noticed, ancient symbols carved into the cabin, patterns in the surrounding forest, and even the child's gaze, as conduits of knowledge and judgment. Miriam's pulse quickened. Knowledge was no longer passive. It was active, a force pressing her toward comprehension, toward surrendering illusions of control. Every act of cruelty she had committed now resonated within this living archive, each secret preserved in memory that extended beyond her lifetime. The shadow's presence was both guide and judge, revealing truths that institutions, families, and societies had suppressed with ruthless precision. And then, a sound, a low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the cabin, carrying the weight of centuries. Miriam understood it as a summons, a challenge, a final test, to confront the breadth of her complicity and the reality of forces she had long ignored. And as the hum intensified, she felt the first true tremor of fear that had nothing to do with death. The hum grew, resonating through every fiber of Miriam's body, syncing with the pounding of her heart. The shadow pressed closer, its presence now a living conduit of history, memory, and judgment. Miriam realized that the cabin was no longer a space. It was a crucible where suppressed truths, forbidden knowledge, and the legacies of cruelty collided. She had always believed mastery lay in fear, in the orchestration of human suffering, but this was a dominion far older, far more exacting. The child's whispers wove through the hum, revealing connections Miriam had never imagined. How families, institutions, and even the church had colluded to suppress African-American resistance, manipulate perception, and rewrite morality to suit power. Each revelation was a mirror reflecting her own crimes, magnifying them through the lens of historical pattern, psychological control, and institutional complicity. Miriam's knife hung useless in her hand, a relic of dominance now rendered irrelevant. She understood that survival depended not on fear, but on comprehension, on aligning herself with truth she had been trained to ignore. The shadow, silent yet omnipresent, guided her gaze toward a map etched faintly in the walls, revealing networks of oppression, secret trails, and erased histories she had helped enforce. She staggered back, realizing that her role in history had been both deliberate and observed. Every hunt she had conducted, every family she had terrorized, every secret she had maintained, each was cataloged, weighed, and placed within a framework that transcended human law. The forest beyond the cabin seemed alive with memory, every rustle a record, every shadow a witness. And then the child's voice pierced the hum with a single command. See it, understand it, and remember. Miriam knew that comprehension was no longer optional. It was survival. And as the map glowed faintly, revealing paths of manipulation she could no longer ignore, Miriam felt the first wave of true reckoning. Miriam's gaze traced the glowing map, each line a revelation of control, suppression, and historical manipulation. Families disappeared, records vanished, and terror was wielded not randomly, but with deliberate precision. Her own ancestors were nodes in this network, and she herself had perpetuated its cycles. The forest, the cabin, the shadow, the child, they were conduits of knowledge, revealing a system designed to observe, manipulate, and preserve truth while erasing innocence. Fear had lost meaning. Power had shifted from dominance over bodies to understanding of systems. Miriam realized that she was not the apex predator she believed herself to be. She was a participant in a web far larger than her own ambitions. Her past crimes were cataloged, analyzed, and contextualized, each act resonating within an intelligence that transcended human comprehension. The child stepped forward, their voice carrying a weight that anchored Miriam to the truth. You are not alone. History watches, memory endures, and judgment is precise. Miriam understood that this was no ordinary reckoning. Every secret she had buried, every lie she had constructed, every life she had claimed, now intersected with truths older than her family, older than the town, older than herself. The shadow shifted, guiding her to another symbol etched into the wall, more complex than the first, representing a convergence of psychological manipulation, institutional control, and the preservation of forbidden knowledge. Miriam felt the ground of her understanding crumble. She was witnessing the mechanisms of history itself, the deliberate orchestration of fear and obedience, and the enduring memory of those whom society had sought to erase. And then a whisper, almost imperceptible, spoke directly to her mind. You hunted shadows, but now the shadow hunts you. Miriam's pulse quickened, knowing that the revelation was not complete, that she was being drawn deeper into the machinery of suppressed history. Miriam's knees weakened as the shadow enveloped the cabin, the symbols on the walls now glowing in unison, revealing a latticework of hidden agendas and institutional corruption spanning centuries. She could see the deliberate erasure of African-American resistance, the manipulation of public perception, and the orchestration of terror as an instrument of power. Every life she had taken, every family she had terrorized, now connected to a system far greater than her understanding. The child's gaze was unwavering, a lens through which Miriam could perceive the continuum of human manipulation and suppression. She realized that the forest, the cabin, the shadow, and the child were not only observers. They were archivists of human cruelty, preserving forbidden knowledge while simultaneously revealing it to those capable of comprehension. Miriam's knife felt absurd in her trembling hands. Her mastery of fear, her dominance over others, her intricate knowledge of human psychology, none of it mattered in the presence of a system that measured legacy, intention, and complicity. Power was not in terror, but in understanding the mechanisms of history itself. As the candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows that merged with the glowing symbols, Miriam saw a pattern, a network of control, manipulation, and psychological conditioning that had spanned centuries. Her family had been active participants, and she had been a faithful executor of their legacy. But now, she was being evaluated, judged by forces she could not flee. And then, the shadow leaned closer, its presence almost corporeal, pressing knowledge in her mind, a revelation so profound it made her past arrogance feel trivial. The child whispered a single phrase, echoing through the walls in her consciousness. The hunter becomes the hunted, and the hidden is revealed. Miriam knew that the next revelation would shatter her perception entirely. Miriam's vision swirled as the realization sank in. She was not simply being observed. She was being taught, judged, and integrated into a continuum of historical reckoning. The cabin became a theater of memory, the forest a living archive, and the shadow an intelligence older than any institution she had ever feared. Each symbol, each whispered phrase, each rustle in the trees was a lesson in power, suppression, and the weight of history. The child's voice cut through the chamber like steel. Every secret has a witness. Every crime has a ledger. Every lie has a consequence. Miriam understood the magnitude of her complicity. Her mastery of fear and manipulation had only scratched the surface of the orchestration of oppression. She had been a cog in a machine far larger than herself, a machine designed to perpetuate control, erase memory, and maintain fear across generations. Her hands trembled over the knife, an absurd relic against the machinery of knowledge she now confronted. The shadow pulsed, pressing her to recognize that comprehension, not dominance, was the ultimate arbiter. The cabin walls shifted, revealing more symbols, each more complex, each representing intricate systems of psychological control, institutional corruption, and the deliberate erasure of African American lives. And then, Miriam realized something darker. She was not simply being shown history. She was being woven into it. Every decision she had made, every life she had destroyed, every secret she had maintained, was now a part of the narrative being preserved, judged, and revealed. The forest itself seemed to lean closer, whispering warnings in the rustle of leaves. A voice, neither human nor child, reverberated through the cabin. To understand is to survive, and to survive is to bear the knowledge of what was hidden. Miriam's pulse raced as the first layer of her reckoning peeled away. Miriam's mind raced as the cabin's walls continued to reveal a lattice of hidden histories. Families erased from records, African American escape networks suppressed, institutions manipulating morality. All these truths converged before her eyes. She understood that her own acts of cruelty were a fraction of the design, a single thread in a tapestry woven to maintain control and fear. The shadow loomed, its presence a living force of comprehension and judgment. Miriam felt the weight of centuries pressing into her consciousness, each revelation layering upon the last. The child's whispers acted as guides, connecting past atrocities to her own family's complicity, illuminating patterns she had never dared to recognize. She realized that power existed not in her knife, her fear tactics, or her dominance, but in knowledge, in understanding, and in recognizing the invisible networks that had always guided human behavior. The forest outside seemed alive with memory, its wind carrying the echoes of every act of manipulation she had executed. Miriam's heart pounded as she perceived the enormity of what was unfolding. She had been both a perpetrator and a pupil in a system older than herself, a system that had observed, cataloged, and preserved human cruelty while keeping it hidden from history. And then the shadow pressed fully into her consciousness, delivering a final revelation before the ultimate judgment. To see the machine is to become part of it, and those who fail to understand are consumed. Miriam understood that her reckoning was not yet complete, and that the next step would redefine everything. Miriam staggered, overwhelmed by the convergence of revelation, judgment, and suppressed history. The symbols etched on the cabin walls glowed, the forest whispered, the shadow pulsed, and the child watched with an intensity that pierced her soul. She now understood that her mastery of fear had been a mask, her control an illusion, and her crimes merely threads in a tapestry of manipulation, oppression, and institutional corruption spanning centuries. The shadow extended, merging with the candlelight, pressing knowledge into her mind. Every act she had committed, every family she had terrorized, every secret she had maintained, each was catalogued, analyzed, and now weighed against the continuum of history. Miriam felt the enormity of her legacy, the burden of her complicity, and the impossibility of escape. The child stepped closer, repeating phrases of forbidden knowledge. Miriam understood that she was not merely witnessing history. She was being woven into it. Every decision she had made, every act of terror, every secret preserved, was now part of a living archive, a system that judged without bias, without mercy, and without end. And then, as the shadow's presence enveloped the cabin, Miriam heard a single phrase echo through her mind, chilling and inevitable. The hunter becomes the hunted, and the hidden must be revealed. Miriam's breath caught as the full weight of comprehension struck her. She had believed herself untouchable, a master of fear and manipulation. Yet she now faced forces that measured cruelty not in blood but in memory, legacy, and the orchestration of truth. Every secret she had maintained, every life she had taken, was a record in a system far older and more deliberate than herself. The shadow moved, a living manifestation of history and judgment, pressing into her consciousness. The child's gaze anchored her, revealing patterns of suppression, psychological control, and institutional complicity that stretched across centuries. Miriam realized she was part of a continuum, a living node in a network of observation, judgment, and revelation. Her knife hung useless at her side, an emblem of a power that no longer held sway. Fear was obsolete. Comprehension was the currency now. The cabin, the forest, the symbols, the shadow, they were instruments of reckoning, showing her the cost of ignorance, arrogance, and cruelty. And then, from the darkness, a whisper: all control is illusion. All deeds are remembered. All secrets are revealed. Miriam understood that the final truth awaited, and that she could neither run nor hide from the reckoning about to unfold. Miriam's mind raced, every revelation layering upon the last. The cabin was alive with memory, the forest a living archive, the shadow an intelligence older than any institution, the child a conduit of forbidden knowledge. She saw the networks of manipulation, oppression, and suppression of truth spanning generations, intersecting with her own actions. Her mastery of terror, her orchestration of fear, her hidden cruelty, all were threads in a tapestry catalogued and preserved by forces she could neither see nor touch. The shadow's presence pressed upon her, guiding comprehension, demanding recognition of patterns she had long ignored. The child whispered the final phrases, repeating them for emphasis. The hidden is revealed. The guilty are known. The reckoning is now. Miriam's pulse quickened. She understood that her legacy, her crimes, and her identity were being assessed in a continuum of judgment beyond mortal comprehension. And then, the shadow withdrew slightly, leaving her with a chilling truth. Knowledge is both liberation and prison. Comprehension is both power and burden, and those who seek to dominate must confront the machinery that has always observed them. Miriam stood in silence, the cabin alive with the echoes of centuries. The shadow lingered, the child's gaze fixed, and the forest outside held its breath. She now understood the full extent of her complicity, the networks of oppression, the hidden agendas, the institutional corruption, and the psychological manipulations she had perpetuated. Fear, dominance, and cruelty had no power here. Knowledge, comprehension, and recognition of hidden forces were the only currency. Miriam realized she was woven into history itself, catalogued, judged, and observed. Every secret she had kept, every life she had taken, every lie she had maintained, was now part of a living archive beyond mortal influence. And as the candles flickered one last time, Miriam's eyes met the child's. The shadow remembers, they whispered, and it reverberated across the cabin, the forest in her soul. She had learned too much, understood too much, and could never return to the illusion of control. Viewers, if you survive these revelations, like, subscribe, and share this story. And remember, some truths are not meant to be buried. For Miriam Blackwell, the hunter became the hunted, and in the darkness, the forest waits for those who dare to uncover what should remain hidden.